Divorce is a trauma that shakes the ground that a family stands on. It breaks up the family, or as clinical psychologists will say, it reorganizes the family. It happens in a lot of homes, even in Christian homes. The people that are damaged in a divorce are not just the spouses that are going through the divorce, but also the children, especially the children. And outside of the family, those that are involved in faith organizations, that attend church on a regular basis, that are active in their churches, oftentimes other church members that were friends of the married couple or friends of the family, they are impacted in a lesser degree, but impacted nonetheless. This video is not going to be a very short video. In this video, I'm going to dig through the issues of divorce from both a religious perspective, a biblical perspective, a psychological or a clinical perspective, and also from my own personal perspective. You see, I grew up in a divorced home. My mother had 5 different husbands, and my father had 2 different wives. There are 12 of us children all together. I have 1 full-blooded brother, 1 full-blooded sister. The rest of the siblings are half-siblings. And I also have some step-brothers and sisters, but only 1 step-sister that I have remained in contact with throughout my adult life. Large group of siblings as a result of a divorce or multiple divorces. As an adult, my first marriage lasted 18 years. It ended in divorce, and I will share with you personal details about that divorce. Things that I did wrong in that marriage. Things that I suspect my wife did wrong. That's a touchy area because saying bad things about an ex-wife never reflects positively on the person doing it. And that is a delicate area. But for the purpose of instruction, for the purpose of learning more about how to minister to people going through divorce, and that's really the thrust of this video. The video, I want to support people that are going through divorce or have gone through divorce, and also I want those in the church family to understand how to deal with people that are going through divorce. So I'm going to first discuss the religious perspectives and the psychological perspectives. Those are things that are not involved with me personally, but these are simple biblical beliefs, biblical teachings, and psychological data that has been gathered by psychologists over the last 50 or 60 years regarding the family breakup and how to prevent it and how to deal with it after it happens. My name is Shane Linder. I am a pastoral counselor. I have my master's degree in counseling, and I am the president of an independent Christian counseling ministry. Okay, so this video is going to be an estimated, probably 90 minutes to 2 hours. It is an in-depth look at this issue of divorce and how it relates to the church. The video is primarily made for either people that are considering divorce, in the middle of a divorce, or have divorced recently, like within the last 2 or 3 years. It is also for ministers that deal with people in divorce, not necessarily pastors, although that would include ordained pastors, but also church elders, children's ministry leaders, church leaders, Sabbath school teachers, deacons, but people that work with families that have experienced divorce. Because this video is primarily going to give an in-depth view of the subject and its relation to the church and how the church can view and help divorced families. And so we're going to look at the biblical view of divorce, the theological view of divorce. And then we're going to look at divorce causes, specifically what goes on in families, in Christian families, where it can lead to divorce. We're going to look at the impact on children. There we're going to look at some psychology, some scientific studies that have been done over the past few years or few decades, over the past 20 or 30 years, where we're really starting to accumulate knowledge on what's happening and what happens to children that experience divorce. We're going to look at the reasons for marriage and how that relates to divorce. I'm going to share my personal story. I'm going to talk about how my marriage started out. I'm going to talk about how we used counseling in my marriage. Also, I will talk about forgiveness, and I will talk about divorce, the divorce that I experienced, and I will talk about dating after divorce and remarriage. This is, like I said, this is a long video, and it is for people that are either experiencing divorce or maybe your son or your daughter has experienced divorce, a family member, somebody that you were involved with in church, like if you're a Sabbath school teacher and you have some children in your Sabbath school that have experienced divorce. But this is a lengthy video, and this isn't just a video that somebody would watch, perhaps somebody that knows me personally or knows my ex-wife and wants to get some juicy details of what happened in the breakdown of our family. If that's why you're watching the video and you're after some juicy details, well, number one, you might be disappointed because you might not get information that you're hoping for. And secondly, you're going to have to watch a pretty long video, and go through a lot of information that I'm presenting in order to get to those few moments of interest to you. So really, this is for people in ministry or people experiencing divorce. And then at the end of the video, I will summarize everything that I put out in the video. Okay, I am the author of this book called Marriage and Divorce: When Dreams Go Wrong, and it's a small book, 70 pages long. It's available on Amazon.com. And if you're ministering to somebody that is going through divorce, or if you're going through divorce yourself, you might find some things in this book helpful. I want to take a look at the biblical view of divorce and start out by looking at Abraham's divorce. The first time divorce is mentioned in the Bible. It is Abraham's divorce, and we know that Abraham is the father of our faith, but we also know that Abraham made some mistakes, like when he went into Egypt with his wife and he lied about Sarah being his wife. He lied to the Pharaoh, and then later he took Hagar as his wife because he doubted, or Sarah doubted, that they could conceive a child in their old age, and so they decided to bring Sarah into the picture, Hagar into the picture. So this was the first divorce, and Abraham divorced Hagar because Sarah told him to, and God's command. In Genesis chapter 21, verse 14, it says that Abraham sent her away. Sarah had said to cast her out. Now the Hebrew word here used to cast out means exactly the same thing as the word translated as divorce in Leviticus, in Numbers, and also in Ezekiel. This word is exactly the same as divorce. That's what it means. Abraham, simply put, Abraham divorced Hagar. And he did this at God's direction. Abraham was saddened, it says, about this, and it's not something that Abraham wanted to do. But God told him to go ahead and to send her away. Ellen White writes about this in the book Patriarchs and Prophets on pages 146 and 147. She wrote, "The Lord, through a holy angel, directed him," referring to Abraham, "directed him to grant Sarah's desire. His love for Ishmael, or Hagar, ought not stand in the way, for only thus could he restore harmony and happiness to his family. Both Abraham and Sarah distrusted the power of God, and it was this error that led to the marriage with Hagar. That's what Ellen White wrote. Now, we do see later in the story that when Abraham died, that Isaac sent for Ishmael and they buried their father together. This seems to indicate that Abraham maintained a relationship with Ishmael after he left, because it would be very strange. Ishmael was about 14 years old at the time that Abraham divorced Hagar. It would be very strange for and Isaac to send for Ishmael, and Isaac at the time was what, like 1 or 2 years old, so it'd be very strange as adults for Isaac to send for Ishmael to come bury their father, the father that abandoned Ishmael when he was a teenager, So the fact that Isaac called for Ishmael to help bury their father Abraham seems to indicate that Abraham did maintain a relationship with his son afterwards. Now, the Islamics believe that Abraham actually traveled down to Mecca to visit his son, but we don't have any sound reason to believe that Ishmael even went all the way to Mecca, or that Abraham traveled back and forth. But that is what is recorded in the Quran. The only reason I bring this up is because Abraham, it doesn't appear that Abraham was a deadbeat dad. He was the father of the faith, and it does appear that he maintained a relationship with Ishmael after the divorce. And certainly in today's society, fathers need to maintain relationships with their children after the divorce. So, what about the law of Moses in divorce? What does that teach? Well, later we find God giving instruction to Moses regarding divorce. And in Deuteronomy 24, verse 1, it reads, "When a man takes a wife and marries her, and happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house." The word here that is translated indecency is the Hebrew word erva. It means nudity, disgrace, blemish, some type of uncleanliness. According to the Seventh-day Adventist Bible commentary, this offense could not have been adultery, for that was to be punished by death. It was simply some behavior the husband considered improper or disgraceful. The Jews understood this Mosaic precept to mean that a man might divorce his wife for almost any reason. We find that in Matthew chapter 19, verses 4 to 6. Christ explained, however, that it was not God's will for divorce to be thusly so easily obtained. We find that in Matthew 19, verse 8. Now, Leslie Vernick, she comments on this in her book, The Emotionally Destructive Marriage. She says, Moses permitted divorce only as a concession of people's hard hearts. God's ideal for marriage hasn't changed. He still wants it to be a lifetime relationship, but hard hearts still cause serious wounds to people in relationships. There are times it is just not wise or safe to stay married if the destructive person has not had a change of heart. They would have too much power to hurt you. So then I want to take a look at the story in Ezra. In the book of Ezra, in chapters 9 and 10, we find Ezra returning to Jerusalem from captivity, from the Babylonian captivity, and he finds that a lot of the Israelites had married foreign wives. And this distressed him to a great deal. He was beyond himself in belief. I mean, the Babylonian captivity had happened because the Israelites had taken foreign wives and been led into idolatry. They had been in captivity for 70 years, and now they're coming out of captivity, and they're going back and doing the very same thing that had led them to be in captivity in the first place. And he was very upset about this, and all the Jews there agreed to mass divorce their wives and send their children away. And this was found acceptable with Ezra. So in the story of Ezra, we see a mass divorce of Jewish people divorcing their pagan wives and sending them away. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, we find what has come to be known as the Pauline Privilege, okay? And I'm not sure how much of a privilege this is, but this allows for the divorce, and this would be in chapter 7, verses 12 to 16. It allows for divorce of an unbeliever, an unbelieving spouse that is not willing to stay with a believer. Now, the terminology here is what is at debate, and it's not agreed upon. But what is an unbelieving spouse, and what are these terms? Generally, it's considered an unbelieving spouse that will not allow his spouse or her spouse to practice their faith. So back in the ancient Roman times, when Paul wrote this letter, there were unbelieving spouses that were not allowing their wives to practice Christianity, and in those circumstances, Paul was granting the divorce. If the unbelieving spouse abandoned them, is really what it comes down to. It's abandonment. And what is abandonment? And does an unbelieving spouse not letting the believing spouse practice their faith, is that abandonment? And then there's also the issue of constructive abandonment. And constructive abandonment comes from the Old English law, and that is where a spouse is very abusive, and so the spouse is not taking care of the other one. They're not taking care of them, so that is seen as a form of abandonment. So the Pauline Privilege is interpreted by different people in different ways. Some say it has to be absolute abandonment, where the unbelieving spouse packs up his suitcase and leaves and walks out and leaves the believer all by herself. That's, in some people's view, that is the only way Pauline Privilege applies. Others say no, if the unbelieving spouse doesn't allow the believing spouse to practice her faith, that is abandonment. And others say if there is abuse, if unbelieving spouse is abusive and thus not taking care of the spouse, the believing spouse, then that would be abandonment. Treacherous divorce. This verse in Malachi 2, verse 16 is often quoted, where God says, "I hate divorce, says the Lord of Israel." And this is the big red flag against divorce, that we cannot get divorced because God hates divorce. And as we read in this, it says, we see that God is talking about treacherous divorce. In verse 15, we find this. It says, "The Lord has been witness between you and your wife of your youth, against whom you have dealt treacherously, though she is your companion and your wife by covenant." The spiritual leaders of Israel were divorcing their wives and marrying foreign, unbelieving wives. The faithful wives who were being divorced were in many times without a means of support. Those divorcing their wives had dealt treacherously with them. They were not divorcing their wives because of abuse or even to restore harmony and happiness in their home. Barbara Roberts, in her book, Not Under Bondage, points out that this passage is difficult to translate. It does not translate literally to say God hates divorce. It says hates divorce in the third party, in the third person. So many translators assume that third person is God. However, not all translators translate it that way. The Holman Christian Standard Bible reads like this: "If he hates and divorces his wife, says the Lord of Israel, he covers his garment with injustice." In that translation, they are translating the third person to apply to the husband and not to God. So it's a tricky verse for translators to translate. Divorce is one of the many consequences of sin. The passage in Malachi clearly teaches that God opposes divorce, regardless of how it is translated. Consider a man leaving his wife and kids for another woman. Then, too, there are housewives that have affairs with their husbands while working, and they supposedly fall out of love with their husband, and they fall in love with their lover, and they divorce. There are situations where one spouse works to put the other spouse through school, and when he or she graduates and gets a good job, divorces the one that supported them and sometimes even paid for their schooling. These are examples of treacherous divorces, and they happen, unfortunately, even in our church, in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, they happen. It is noteworthy that Malachi was a contemporary of Ezra. So during this time period, when Ezra was instructing the Hebrews to divorce their pagan wives, Malachi was reprimanding Hebrews for divorcing their wives, the wives of their youth. So the I hate divorce verse that is so often quoted in the divorce discussion was written during the same era that the prophet Ezra was commanding divorcees, or commanding Israelites to divorce unbelievers. The traditional Protestant position on divorce states that the Bible gives only one reason for divorce, which is adultery, based on the words of Christ in Matthew 19:8. Some also include abandonment based on Paul's epistle, as we discussed already. The Seventh-day Adventist Church added the Pauline Privilege to the church manual at the General Conference session of 2000. Of course, after doing that, the minority that voted against it were pretty noisy and made a lot of noise saying that it shouldn't have been done. But the majority did vote to add the Pauline Privilege. Okay. The passage from Jesus that is a discussion in this is not without debate itself. Monica Sharman, author of the book The Bible, Sex, and This Generation, points out that she believes the adultery exception spoken by Christ is often misunderstood. First mentioned during the Sermon on the Mount, Christ was preaching about adultery. In verse 28, he says, if a man looks on a woman with lust, he commits adultery. In verse 32, he says, if a man divorces his wife, he also commits adultery. And then I'm going to read a quote out of her book. In Matthew 5:32, Jesus is teaching that divorce by the husband is tantamount to breaking the seventh commandment. If, however, the husband has not divorced his wife and she has sex with another man, then this first husband is not sinning. Close quote. In this view, Jesus was not saying a man should divorce his wife if she commits adultery, nor was he teaching that adultery is a justifiable reason for divorce. He was pointing out that when a man divorces his wife, which results in her sleeping with another, it is the man who unjustly put her away that is guilty of adultery. Understand what they're trying to say there. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is saying, if you lust after a woman, that is the same as committing adultery. And then in the next sentence he says, and if you divorce a woman, that is the same as committing adultery. Okay, just stop the thought there. He's saying, if you lust after a woman, that's the same as committing adultery. If you divorce a woman, that's also the same as committing adultery. But then to the divorce, he puts an exception in there. And he says, unless she committed adultery. Okay, and so what he's saying is, he's not saying that it's okay to divorce her, or it's okay to divorce her if she commits adultery. He's saying that if the woman commits adultery, then the man is not guilty of adultery when he divorces her. However, if the woman did not commit adultery and the man divorces her, then the man is guilty of committing adultery. You see, so it's not, in that view, it is not that Jesus is saying that adultery is a reason for divorce. Jesus is simply saying that if adultery has occurred, then a man that divorces his wife is not guilty of it. That the woman is, because she actually committed adultery. Now, these teachings of Jesus are found in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Notice in Matthew 18, verses 4 to 9, the Pharisees were asking Jesus what the justifiable grounds are of divorce. Jesus could have responded that adultery was the only justifiable grounds, but that is not how he answered the question. In fact, he basically said there are no justifiable grounds. He said that what God has put together, let no man separate. That was his answer. Then, to double down on his answer, he said that if a man divorces his wife, and he causes her to commit adultery, unless, of course, she commits adultery first. Jesus answered the Pharisees' question in verse 6. Now, the adultery is mentioned in verse 9. Okay, so here's the question. In verse 9, when Jesus makes an exception in his response to verse 6, is he making an exception in verse 9? Is he making an exception to his answer in verse 6? Or in verse 9, is he doubling down on his answer in verse 6? How would that be doubling down? In verse 6, Jesus said, no man is to separate what God has put together. In verse 9, he goes one step further. Not only should no man separate what God has put together, but if you do, you cause your wife to commit adultery. Now, when we look at this passage in Mark, Jesus doesn't say anything about adultery when speaking to the Pharisees. It isn't until he goes into the house and the disciples ask him about it that he brings up adultery. The passage in Luke doesn't even mention the adultery exception. Okay, so what we have happening is the Pharisees ask him this question. And they ask him about the grounds for divorce. And he tells the Pharisees there are no grounds for divorce. What God has put together, man is not to take apart. That's his answers to the Pharisees. Then he goes into the house with his disciples alone. His disciples ask him about it, and that's when he even mentions the adultery exception. So whilst the traditional Protestant position says that adultery is the only grounds for divorce, one way to interpret this passage from Jesus is to say, no, it's not. Adultery is not a reason for divorce. Jesus says no divorce, zero divorce. Nothing is a reason for divorce. So does that mean that we should never get divorced? No, what it means is that divorce is always wrong. God permits it. God permitted it in the law of Moses because of the hardness of the heart. The same is true today in that understanding, is that God still permits divorce today because of the hardness of the heart. But it was never God's will before, and it isn't God's will today. God's will is reconciliation. Even if there's adultery, God's will is reconciliation. It's not for anything else. God's will is always reconciliation. That is that viewpoint. Adultery is not grounds for divorce in that view of it. So the traditional Protestant view says adultery only. Some Protestants allow for abandonment. This other way of viewing that is to say divorce is never God's will, but God allows it for the hardness of our hearts. Divorce in Christian homes. What are the causes of divorce in Christian homes? Well, there is a study, and it is referenced at the end of this presentation. You'll see references that I list there. There was a study done, and it found that adultery and pornography are among the biggest reasons for divorce within Christianity. Now, of course, in the traditional view, Protestant view, they allow divorce for adultery. Some are very divided on pornography, and pornography certainly is a topic of debate, whether or not pornography is the same as adultery. Jesus equates hate to being the same as murder. If you hate your brother, you have murdered him in the heart. And he says lust is the same as adultery. And, I think many people would agree that pornography is lust. It's not the same as physical adultery. So it is like comparing the difference between hatred and murder. If I murder somebody, I can go to prison. If I hate them, they don't lock me up for that. If it stops at hate, if it doesn't progress to murder. So pornography and adultery, some churches would probably say pornography is adultery and justify as a divorce. I tend to be of the belief that no divorce is justifiable. That tends to be my belief. I don't think any divorce is justifiable. I think God always wants reconciliation. And so regardless if it's physical adultery or if it's pornography, God always wants reconciliation. I think from a therapeutic, from a psychological point of view, treating pornography addiction and treating adultery, both of them can be treated. Which one is more difficult to treat? I think that's up to the individual. Some people that have committed adultery can repent of that and change relatively easy when they see the errors of their ways, and some people that are in pornography addiction find it incredibly difficult to completely let go of. So I think that has a lot to do with the individual. Another disturbing cause for divorce among Christians is poor communication. They're not communicating, and they grow apart. They're living in the same house. They're not talking together. They become two different people, two different lives, interested in different things, and they don't know each other anymore. After 5 or 10 years of not talking to each other much, you really don't know who you're living with. Unfortunately, that happens in Christian homes. Addiction, alcoholism and drug addiction. This is very common, a common cause of divorce. Not that it's that common in the church, but it's a common cause of divorce in the church, and that's difficult. Hard to judge somebody without walking a mile in their shoes. And if you haven't lived with an alcoholic or an addict, it's hard to judge somebody for divorcing somebody like that. Of course, I believe that God wants reconciliation, and I don't believe God ever wants divorce. But addiction causes a lot of divorce, and I am sympathetic to that. Abuse. Could be emotional abuse, could be physical abuse, or could be sexual abuse. All three types of abuse cause divorce. And again, I'm not saying it's justifiable. I think most types of abuse can be worked through in therapy. I think most people that are abusive, if they express a desire to change, that the counseling is very effective, and they can get past the abuse if they recognize they have a problem and they want help. Sexual problems. I think this tends to go hand in hand with poor communication. Some people are very vocal, and so when they have sexual intimacy with their spouse, they tell their spouse things that they want them to do, things they want to do sexually with them, and they communicate very well. Other people, especially when it comes to sex, no communication. And, for example, a husband that is just after his own pleasure could fail to please his wife for years, 5, 10 years. The woman goes without ever having a pleasurable sexual experience. The only one that's enjoying sex is the husband. And after a while, that can lead to divorce. So whose fault is it? That's different couples of different. Every couple is different. Could be the woman's fault for never talking to her husband and telling her husband what she needs. It could be the husband's fault for being so selfish and not even caring about his wife's pleasure. Each couple is different, but if they're both willing to go to counseling and talk about it, and both willing to make changes, the success rate is very high. Unfortunately, a lot of people don't want to go to a counselor and talk about their sex life, and so they wind up getting divorced. I suggest that talking to a counselor about your sex life is a much less painful experience than getting divorced. And financial problems. Financial problems used to be the number one problem, but not so much anymore. Maybe because we're becoming wealthier as a nation, I don't know, but financial problems still is an issue, but not as big of an issue as it once was. Okay, the impact of divorce on children. We can see there is a study out of Malaysia, actually, that was done in 2011 that gave 4 indicators of harm for children, the children going through divorce. If they express these 4 things, it shows that there is harm taking place. And one is externalizing problems. Externalizing problems is basically bad behavior. Mom and dad is getting divorced and the child starts acting out and getting in trouble, fighting or stealing or whatever it might be, and it's uncharacteristic. The child didn't do that before. That's externalizing problems. That's directly related to the divorce. Okay, internalizing emotions. Okay, the child feels bad, feels guilty, feels angry, whatever the emotion might be, and doesn't express that emotion. That is often caused by a divorce. Academic issues. The grades drop in school. Child starts doing poorly in school, and this happens after the marriage problems begin, after the divorce begins. Protective factors. This is not what the child is doing, but what other people around the child is doing. We notice that the school teachers start getting involved in the child, maybe calling the parents, talking to the parents. Maybe they send the child to a counselor at the school. Maybe the pastor gets involved in counseling, or the parents decide to take the child to a professional counselor. Basically, outside help, something outside the nuclear family starts impacting. Could be grandparents taking the children to live with them. But these protective factors kick in. And the protective factors kicking in is an indication that something is wrong. Okay. Now, a study done in Turkey in 2018 indicated that there's a direct tie between teenagers experiencing divorce, where their parents are divorcing, and impulsivity. Okay, they started having trouble with impulsivity with teenagers in school when their parents were getting divorced. A 2003 study in the Journal of Child and Family Studies revealed that over 45% of children develop PTSD while they're going through divorce. That is a jaw-dropping statistic. Over 45%. That's almost half of the children that experience divorce develop post-traumatic stress disorder. In the 2000 Journal of the American Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, they found that, or they reviewed all the scientific articles, is what they did. They reviewed all the scientific articles published from 1990 to 1999, and they determined that long-term harm is nearly always done to children going through divorce, although it is not always tied to the divorce. And that is that there's other things going on. A lot of these families have abuse happening to them. They have high stress in the family. They have conflict in the family. There's a divorce, and then after the divorce, there's continued conflict, or their avoidance. The husband and wife avoid each other, and things that are happening before and things that are happening after all contribute. And so in this article published in the Journal of American Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, they did determine that long-term damage happens to most children, but they also determined that it's not necessarily tied to the divorce itself. Some have joked around that the number one cause of divorce is marriage. Well, I guess that does reason a bit, because if you don't get married, then you're not going to get divorced. But in reality, big cause of divorce is marrying for the wrong reasons. And people that are pressured into getting married oftentimes get divorced, and those are often the ugliest divorces And the children tend to suffer the most in those divorces. So as society, we really need to think about pressuring people into getting married. The shotgun weddings are really not making the best of a bad situation. And what happens there is a couple starts engaging in premarital sex. The girl gets pregnant. The family then reasons that the boy needs to marry the girl to support her financially and raise that child up. But oftentimes, a good boyfriend or a good girlfriend does not make a good husband or wife. And that is that people tend to date other people so that they have fun. They go dancing together, they go to concerts together, they party together, whatever the case is. But those things are not the making of a good marriage. They might have a lot of fun together and a lot of laughs together while they're dating, but they get married and they get underneath the same house, and they're just not compatible. And the marriage ends up falling apart. It's a bitter divorce. The custody is fought over or whatever. They don't work well together, and the children suffer long term. So getting married for the wrong reasons is setting up a divorce, really. There's other reasons that are wrong too. Some people get married because they're lonely and they think that the marriage will fulfill an emptiness that they have. And in that case, what they really need, what they probably need, is a relationship with God. And that relationship with God would be able to fill that emptiness. But it's not like turning on a light switch that it instantly happens. A relationship with God is built over a period of time. And the quickest such a good relationship could happen would be over a period of months, but often it takes over a period of years. Marriage is not going to fill that emptiness. And in some case, that emptiness is caused by psychological disorder. And marriage certainly isn't going to cure a psychological disorder. More than likely, it will complicate it. So that is also a reason not to get married. We don't get married to cure loneliness. We don't get married to cure an emptiness that is inside us. When we do those things, we're doing them for the wrong reason. Some also think that by marrying somebody, they can fix them. That is, like an alcoholic that has a drinking problem, and the spouse thinks if I marry that person, I'll be able to fix their drinking problem. Yeah, that's setting oneself up for a divorce too. So we really need to check the reasons that we're getting married. The reasons we should get married is because we have found a compatible mate that we want to partner with and go through life with. Number one compatibility is that they are of the same religious faith. So if they're not of the same religious faith, we're setting ourselves up for trouble right then. But in addition to being of the same religious faith, there's a number of other compatibility issues. And it's wise for a couple that are thinking about marriage to take a compatibility test as early into the relationship as they can. That's one of the advantages of a lot of the dating websites, is when the person signs up for a dating website, a lot of them have them take a compatibility test right up front. And that goes a long way to decreasing the chances of divorce. So getting married for the right reasons, we're looking for a godly partner to go through life with. And that is why we should get married. Now, if we get somebody pregnant before marriage, should we avoid marriage? Well, sometimes we jump the gun, so to speak. Two people of the same religious denomination might be dating each other. They may be compatible with each other. They plan on getting married next year or the year after. Maybe they're in college and they're going to get married after college, whatever the case is, and they start having sexual relations before they get married, and the girl ends up getting pregnant. Well, just because the girl gets pregnant, that doesn't mean they should avoid getting married. They go ahead with their marriage plans. Should it mean that they speed up the marriage? Maybe, maybe not. That's really something that the couple needs to consider, because speeding up a marriage may not always be right either. Certainly, if they're in a relationship with God and they jump the gun and they're having sexual relations and she gets pregnant, that they should certainly think about not having sexual relations until they get married, even though they've already done it, so to speak, doesn't mean that they cannot abstain until they get married. And I've known couples that have done that. They've jumped the gun, they've had premarital sex, they have conviction that it wasn't the right thing to do, and then they discuss it among themselves and decide not to do it again until they get married. That's perfectly acceptable. Just because we stumble and we fall doesn't mean we have to stay down. We can get back up. Like they say, you fall off a horse, you get back on and ride it again. So getting married for the wrong reasons really sets up a person for a divorce. And it not only sets them up for a divorce, but an ugly divorce where the children really suffer. I believe that my first marriage did get off to a good start. Now, I did ask my first wife to marry me rather quickly. I had only known her for a few days, actually. I was doing missionary work in El Salvador, and I met her, and she was attending a school there. I was building an orphanage next to the school. However, our dating period did last over a year, which is what's recommended. So I didn't meet her and jump right into marriage. Before asking her to marry me, even though it was just a few days, I talked to her pastor, and I talked to some of her friends, and I talked to some of her school teachers. Now, she was 23 years old, but she was in school. So, I did some homework. I talked to my mother. I actually consulted my mother about it. So, I did a lot of right things. It wasn't the best situation. Ideally, you'd want to date somebody for a year and a half before you ask them to marry you, and then be engaged for a year or a year and a half before getting married. But we met. We were both of the same religious faith, and we dated for a year, and then we got married, and our marriage started off very well. We waited for 4 years before we had children, and those 4 years were very much like a honeymoon. We got very involved in the church. We were attending church services 4 or 5 times a week, going to prayer meeting, Vespers, Divine Service, AY, that's a afternoon youth service. I became an elder at the church, and so we traveled and preached at different churches. We started some missionary work in Mexico, and we did that missionary work together. We were really two partners having the same goals, walking together, getting along very well. It was a good and a healthy marriage. So, that's what happens, or what we've seen happen, is when a divorce does happen, those married couples that started off good typically have a cleaner divorce, and especially after the divorce is over. Because when the divorce papers are filed with the courthouse, it gets tense. No matter how good you were together or how much in love you were to begin with, feelings get hurt, people get put on defense, things tend to get ugly, especially if you're fighting over custody of the children or marital assets. But once the divorce is over, the divorce papers are signed, it takes a little while to accept, 2-3 months, maybe 6 months in some cases, but it takes a little while to accept. But once the divorce is over and the people are divorced, those couples that were very much in love to begin with, or got along together well to begin with, as ex-spouses, they tend to get along well. Not super well because, they are divorced, but they tend not to fight with each other. They tend to try to avoid conflicts, especially if they have minor children that they're raising together. They cooperate for the benefit of the children. The couples that married for the wrong reasons are the ones that really have difficulty after they get married. Those that married for the right reasons and something happens, they get divorced, they tend to do a much better job at getting along with each other after the divorce is over. My wife and I, we attended counseling actually twice during our marriage prior to any divorce problems. Of course, when there became marriage problems and divorce was on the table, we attended marriage counseling in an attempt to prevent the divorce from happening, and unfortunately that wasn't successful. But prior to that, in the marriage, we attended counseling on 2 occasions just because we needed some guidance. The first was when, about 2 years into the marriage, I discovered that Sophia wanted to eat meat. Sophia felt like I was forbidding her from eating meat, and we're Seventh-day Adventists, we're vegetarians, and this is something that while I was dating Sophia, actually, in the short time before I asked her to marry me, I asked her if she was a vegetarian. And the reason I asked her that is because I didn't want diet to become an issue in our marriage. So I wanted to marry somebody that had same diet as I did, so that, and food is a bonding thing. When you sit down and you have a meal with somebody, you eat meals together, go out to restaurants together, this is a real bonding activity. So I felt it was pretty important to be on the same page. So while we were dating, I asked her if she was vegetarian, and she said she was. Well, then in the course of our marriage, after a couple of years, she made the comment to somebody once that I would not allow her to eat meat. And I kind of looked at her strange, and I said, but you're a vegetarian. And she's like, no, I'm not a vegetarian. And I said, well, you told me you were a vegetarian when we were dating. Well, she was attending an Adventist boarding school. And she says, well, I was a vegetarian at the boarding school, but not when I went home. Well, you can see how that was a little misleading, So I said, well, this is an issue. I said, so when we have children, because we didn't have children at the time, I says, when we have children, I want to raise my children as vegetarians. And so there was a pastor, a female pastor, that ran a nursing school in the area, and we sat down and we did some pastoral counseling with her, and we discussed the issue, and we came to a compromise, and that is that Sophia, my wife, she could eat meat outside of the home. So if we went to a restaurant and she wanted to order meat, she would be free to eat meat. Or if we were visiting other people's homes and they were serving meat, she was free to eat meat. But in our home, we would not have meat. We would not serve meat. And so that was the compromise that we came to. Now, some years later, after we had children, we were having some issues with child discipline. It was not a conflict between my wife and I. She did not have a problem with how I was disciplining the children, nor did I have a problem with the way she was disciplining children. We just, as together, we wanted to get on board with how we should discipline our children. And we were attending a church at the time, and so we talked to our pastor, and he was a pastor. He has a master's in divinity, a PhD in public health. He was a pretty experienced individual, and he came out to our home on a couple occasions, talked to us about parenting. He gave us some good tips, some good ideas, and we used those throughout raising our children. And I think our children are much better off, because the way that my wife was raised by her children was an authoritarian way, and the way I was raised was a mix of authoritarian and neglectful. So neither my wife nor I had good examples to follow. And the pastor gave us some good instruction, which later in life, when I went to school and I got my master's degree in family counseling, later in life, I learned that what the pastor had taught us is exactly the way that parents should raise their children. It is the healthiest way. And so because we went and we got that counseling when our children were very young, we were able to parent our children very well and give our children a very healthy upbringing. It is easier to forgive somebody if you understand them, and if you understand yourself. As I mentioned, both my ex-wife and I, we had bad parenting examples from our parents. Well, we came from dysfunctional homes, and in my case, which I'll talk about briefly, my father was abusive, physically abusive to my mother. They were both alcoholics. backslidden Seventh-day Adventist, so it's was not a real good, healthy environment. My father physically abused my mother while she was pregnant, and we know that the fetus feels the emotions of the mother during pregnancy. So when I was born, I already had psychological issues. Now, I did develop alcoholism and drug addiction when I was 13, 14. I was sober already by the time I was 16. Through some intervention that happened, I got put into an adolescent treatment facility, got out of there, and got into a 12-step recovery support group. And I had been active in that support group for a number of years by the time I sobered, or by the time I got married. So when I got married, I'd already been sober 10 or 11 years. I had a lot of recovery, a lot of good instruction, a lot of good things in my character that were a result of that recovery. I returned to the Christian church when I was 21 years old, married when I was 27, so I had been a Christian for a while. I had been in recovery for a while, although this abusive childhood that I'd come through, I still had issues, and I still do from that. A childhood like that impacts a person lifelong, although there's things that we can do to diminish that, and some of that I had done by the time I got married, but there were issues there that I still had. My wife, my ex-wife, in her background, her father was a Seventh-day Adventist, a practicing Seventh-day Adventist, but he had married somebody that was not an Adventist, so he was unequally yoked, and he had, I think, 4 children, 4 girls at that time, and he had an extramarital affair. My ex-wife was the result of that extramarital affair, so she was born to her father's lover. We don't know exactly what was going on between her father and his lover, but when my ex-wife was 4 days old, the lover showed up at her dad's door, knocked on the door. The wife, her father's wife, answered the door, and the lover gave the child, my ex-wife, to the wife and said, if he doesn't want me, I don't want his kid either. And so my ex-wife was abandoned by the birth mother when she was 4 days old. We don't know what was going on during that pregnancy. What type of emotions was her biological mother feeling while she was pregnant. My ex-wife was probably born with some psychological issues as well. Of course, her father didn't want her. Her father's wife didn't want her. So the father handed her off to his mother, which was her paternal grandmother. And her paternal grandmother raised her. But obviously she felt like a very rejected child. The father did have interaction with her, but from stories she tells, she was always the one that was left out. If the father bought new shoes for all of his children, she didn't get any. If the father bought ice cream for everybody, she didn't get ice cream. She was like the unwanted child. At least that was her perception. This is what she relayed to me. So she was raised as a rejected and unwanted child. When she was around 7 or 8 years old, at some point, her father divorced his wife, his first wife, and the first wife immigrated to the United States, was gone. They were in El Salvador. Father remarried when my ex-wife was around 7, 8 years old. The new wife was a Seventh-day Adventist, had compassion on my ex-wife, adopted her, legally adopted her, and they renamed my ex-wife after the stepmother. The stepmother genuinely loved her and showed love to her. But we know from childhood development and what we've learned that my ex-wife was already 7 years old. The first 3 years are crucial, are extremely crucial. The first 7 years are crucial. After a child is 7 years old, damage done before that time, it's lifelong. So although her stepmother loved her dearly, and still does for that matter, no amount of love could fix the damage that was done. So she was damaged severely damaged. Once she got into adolescence, my ex-wife, she became very rebellious, which is very typical of children raised in that situation. And then she was sent off to her uncle's house to live with her uncle. And there was some abuse that went on there. So then she was abused as a teenager. Wasn't allowed to continue in school. She had to go to work, which is why she was 24 years old and in school when I met her, because then when she became an adult to make decisions for herself, she decided to go to school and work her way through, to pay her way through schooling. She was an active Seventh-day Adventist, but a lot of baggage. So that's where we got married. And when I married her, I did not know any of this background. This was stuff I learned later. So I was damaged coming out of my childhood, although I had some good experience with the recovery program. And she was damaged coming out of her childhood, although she had spent some years at the academy that was of her decision, and she had a lot of good spiritual instruction coming from that academy. She had the heart of a servant, and she does still have the heart of a servant. She loves to serve the Lord. She loves to serve other people and make other people happy. She is a great asset to a religious community like a church, and she was a very good wife for many years. But the issues from her childhood, I believe, came back to haunt her. She's never been diagnosed with any disorders. She's never went to any psychologist or psychiatrist or anything to be diagnosed. So I don't know if she has a disorder or not. My observation is I think that she has an anxiety disorder, and I think that it was probably something that she always had, but it heightened after the children were born. Children bring a certain amount of stress into a marriage, and that's what I can see happening. I saw it happening during the marriage. It's not that I had to look back on it. I saw how she interacted with the children and some issues that she had with other people, personal relationship issues with other people at church. And so, it is understandable, and it is the result of a traumatized childhood. And I think that's why I'm able to forgive her, because I don't see her as a bad person. I see her as a sick person. And when I look in the mirror, I see I have issues myself. So I'm not looking down upon her at all. She harbored a lot of resentments. There was a lot of little things that I did in the marriage that were objectionable for her, that she didn't like. And I'm not going to detail all of that in this video, but we all do things that are inconsiderate at times when we're married. Oftentimes it's unthinking. We're just not thinking about how our actions will impact the other person. It's not that we're intentionally trying to harm them, but we unintentionally do things that are offensive to our spouse. And in my marriage, there were a number of those things. And the type of temperament that my ex-wife had, she would not be vocal about these things. If I did something that offended her, she wouldn't tell me that it offended her. She would just bury it down deep inside of her and get resentful. Okay. Well, after so many years of marriage, those things piled up. Because she was not vocalizing them to me. So I was not apologizing for them. There was no reconciliation. There was no amends being made. There were just all these little offenses that I was doing to her, and all these resentments that were building up in her. And over a period of time, she got very angry. And the way that she decided to get back at me, or to get revenge, was to have extramarital affairs. So, and in her mind, and she's not unique, this is a lot of people with that temperament have that type of thinking. In her mind, these affairs were justified because of all the things I had done to her. In her mind, I no longer loved her. In her mind, I was using her as a sex doll, so to speak. The only reason I had her around was so that she could satisfy me sexually. That she felt used. She did not feel loved. And that was what was going on in her mind. You see, in my mind, it was a completely different story. In my mind, we had a Christian home. We attended church regularly. We would have family worship. Our children were in Christian school. We would listen to Christian music in the home. We would watch Christian movies, or Christian cartoons. We would laugh together. We would go out to the zoo and the beach together. We interacting as a family. In my side of the perspective, I thought we had a good home. I was doing little things to her offend her that I wasn't even conscious that these things were offending her. She was building resentments with me over a period of time that I was unaware of. So that's what was going on in the marriage. For her side of the marriage, she was miserable. She felt used, and she felt victimized. And on my side, I was falling in love with her deeper and deeper every day. I would look at her sleeping in bed and thank God that I had this woman with me. I was completely oblivious to the fact that she was unhappy in the marriage. And it's because of the temperament that she has that she doesn't vocalize issues, and instead she internalizes them and just builds up resentments. And that's very, very common. There's a lot of people out there like that. I became aware that she was having affairs, cyber affairs. Probably, 10 years, no, probably 12 years into the marriage. And I talked to her about him. She denied him. I asked if we could talk to her mother, because I felt that if anybody was going to take her side, it would be her mother. So she didn't want to talk to the pastor about it. She was just afraid that the pastor would take my side. And I says, well, how about we talk to your mother? And so we called her. Her mother was in El Salvador. We called her on the phone, and we talked about the issue with her mother. And she denied it was happening. But I received a phone call from a man's wife, and it was something that was happening, and she did not believe or did not admit to it happening. And so I made the conscious decision to believe her, because I was going to stay in that marriage. And my children were still young at that time. They were under 7 years old, and we know the first 7 years is crucial. And so trying to keep that marriage together for the kids, it was a valid reason. So the marriage lasted about another 2 years before the problems started. And that, after a couple more years, then my wife came to me and told me that she wanted a divorce, that she couldn't live a lie anymore. And she didn't elaborate right away, so she didn't confess that she was committing adultery, but she kept saying that she was living a lie. And the lie that she would say is that she doesn't love me, and so then staying in the marriage not loving me was living a lie. Initially I told her regarding custody of the children that I would agree to joint custody as long as the children could stay in the Christian school, and I would pay the Christian school tuition in lieu of child support. Because I went on to the Attorney General's website and I did the mathematics there, how much child support would be, and the child support would just be slightly less than what I was paying for the children's tuition. And I realized that I couldn't afford to pay both the tuition and child support. So if I had to pay child support, the children would no longer be able to attend Christian school. And that was very important to me. So I told her, that the children can stay with you 1 week and me 1 week, or with you 1 month and me 1 month, however we want to work it out. They can attend the school and I will pay the school's tuition in lieu of child support. And that was not acceptable to her. She said that she wanted full custody, and she wanted me to pay her child support, and that she wanted to put the children in public school. Okay, well, the children were under the same impression I was. I was under the impression that we had a good Christian home and everything was going well. And so the children were also, under this impression. Their mom was a church leader at the time, involved in child ministries. So, they were caught off guard. I was caught off guard. And, when she says that she wanted to put them in public school, the children were like, no, we want to stay with Dad. So this started a child custody battle, and it lasted 3.5 years. Okay, when it ended, I ended up with the custody of the children, and I did not require my ex-wife to pay child support. At some point during this 3.5 years, my wife confessed to a lot. I don't know if she confessed to everything, but she confessed to a lot. She confessed to cyber affairs, having cyber sex with different people. She confessed to physical affairs, having a physical affair with somebody. And she said that's why she wants a divorce. And when she first said this to me, the tone of her voice and everything, I thought that she was wanting reconciliation and looking for forgiveness. And she was sitting in front of me. We were sitting face to face, and I took her head in my hands and I pulled it close to me and I kissed her on the forehead. And I told her, I says, you are forgiven. Yeah. And she was very surprised by that. And she kind of pushed back a bit. And she goes, have you no dignity? I have been cheating on you. And she did not want forgiveness. She wanted freedom. And the reason that she confessed all these things to me is not because she was looking for reconciliation. She wanted me to get angry and to push her away and to go, because I had been trying to reconcile. I'd been paying for Christian counseling and trying to reconcile this marriage. And so by confessing to me, she thought that would be it. I would quit trying to reconcile. I would push her away. I would be angry. And we could move forward with the divorce. So, and I told her that, I says, I have committed sins in my life, and Jesus has forgiven me of my sin. And so how can I not forgive you of your sin? And the unfortunate thing is that my ex-wife doesn't know how to accept love. And that's, I believe, was because of her childhood experience before she was 7 years old. And that played out with her adopted mother. Her adopted mother loved her to death. But because she was so damaged, she didn't know how to accept that love. Which is why she went into rebellion as a teenager. If she could have accepted the love, if she could have known how much her adopted mother loved her, I don't think she would ever went into that rebellious stage. And then when we got married, after a period of years, she went into that rebellious stage with me. She felt victimized when, and in fact, it's not that I victimized her. It's not that I abused her in any way. I loved her. And the issues that she had that she was being offended over were minor issues that could have easily been resolved if she would have been vocal about them. But this isn't personal. I don't think of her personally as being somebody that is personally bad. I see her as being damaged. Yeah, it's like she is ill. She's not a bad person. She's a sick person. And so how would I treat somebody that is in the hospital struggling with pneumonia or some type of illness? I would be compassionate and loving towards them. And that is how I try to treat my ex-wife, be compassionate and loving towards her. And someday, she may get help, and she might become a semi-healthy individual. That has been known to happen, and I pray for that. But at that point in my marriage, it was coming to an end. And I ended that marriage with forgiveness. It was Christmas time when my ex-wife first told me that she wanted a divorce. The house was all decorated. Christmas tree, Christmas music was playing. Just a few days before Christmas, I was really taken off guard. And she seemed to be taken off guard that I was taken off guard. And she says to me, "Don't you think you would be happier without me?" Very low self-esteem, which is also part of her temperament. People with her temperament struggle with low self-esteem. I had tears in my eyes. And I was looking at the ground. I looked up at her and I said, "No." I was building an addition to our house that would more than double the size of our house, and I gestured off towards the addition that I was building, and I said, I'm building that for us. And we were just paying off the mortgage on the house. I had like 3 or 4 payments left. And then once we paid off the mortgage on the house, I was really going to be able to throw some money at that addition and get that addition complete. We're going to be financially good, because life had been a financial struggle with her, because she did not work. She stayed at home, and I paid for the Christian education of the children. And Christian education is not just the tuition. You got to pay for the transportation of the kids to school and your grocery bill. You have to give them breakfast and lunch. And if you send your children to public school, they can ride the public bus. It's free. The school feeds them breakfast, feeds them lunch. So public education is actually a very helpful for families financially. And so we were struggling to get our children through Christian education. And my wife was able to stay home and thus do much more volunteer work at the church. I was happy. I was happy in my marriage. I was happy with my family, even though financially we were not doing that well. But at this point, my career was advancing, and I was about to pay off the mortgage on our house. So, and my wife had talked about going to work, and so, the children were now in school. So if I pay off the mortgage and she starts working, we would be able to start vacationing and taking the kids to a lot of different places, which we had never been able to vacation very much because the Christian education took most of our money. So I was really taken off guard. And as I mentioned here a moment ago, when she wanted the divorce, I offered split custody, and she didn't want that, and so we went through this custody battle. And during the divorce, she stayed in the house for a while, but she slept in a different room, and she did get a job. She got a job shortly after she told me that she wanted a divorce. And her shift was 6 in the morning till 3 in the afternoon. And so she would get up in the morning before the children or I'd get up, and she'd be gone by the time we'd get up. And the children would come home on the bus. I paid for the bus. And that bus dropped them off a couple blocks from the house, and they would walk home. So they became latchkey kids. They open up the house and nobody'd hear. Which my ex-wife got off work at 3 o'clock, and she could have been here when the kids got home from work. She's going through, this emotional stuff, and she would go to the gym, and she would work out at the gym. And if she came home, it normally wasn't until 6 or 7 o'clock at night And oftentimes after going to the gym, she would do other things. She got into roller derby and she started taking dance lessons. And so a lot of times she wouldn't get home till 9 or 9:30, and I was putting the kids to bed at 8. And so oftentimes she would be up and gone before the kids got up, and the kids would be in bed by the time she came home. So during this divorce period, I really was a single dad, even though my ex-wife was still in the house. On her days off, she would normally sleep in, and so I would get the children up for school and off to school, and she would still be in bed. And then, of course, when the children came home, she was gone. So even on her days off, the children were not interacting with her. It was 1 or 2 days a week that they would see her and interact with her. I would still be up when she came home, so I was interacting with her most days. We were very civil. Very civil. Even though divorce papers had been filed, we were not arguing, we were not fighting. If you were a peeping Tom and you looked through the window, you would not have been able to figure out that we were a couple getting divorced, other than at bedtime she went to sleep in one room and I went to sleep in another. And that went on for quite a while. Then she got into a fight with the children once, and this was after school and I wasn't home, and she was angry that they wanted to stay with me, and I wasn't part of that argument, but she got in her car and she left, and the children went months without seeing her, and she didn't call them on the phone or anything, and we had a tough time emotionally. I got some professional help for myself, some counseling, got some professional help for the children, a couple consultations, not anything extended, but it was tough. Now I was consulting with my 12-step sponsor, I was consulting with my pastor, and then I also hired a Christian counselor that I was paying and consulting with her. I was trying to follow the rules, so to speak. I was trying to do things the best way I could, and because the divorce was requiring so much money, I was just shoveling money to my lawyer. So I was shoveling money to a counselor and to my lawyer, and the mortgage was paid off, but that money was being shoveled over to counselors and lawyers. It was a difficult time, but eventually the children spoke with the judge and told the judge that they wanted to stay with me, and my lawyer spoke with my wife's lawyer, and they agreed to that if I would not require child support, and so I agreed to that. Shortly after the divorce, visitation began. The children started visiting, doing the weekend visits with their mother and Wednesday after school visits, and we moved into a co-parenting relationship. A study done in 1989 by Hetherington reveals that children normally recover from a divorce, not just the children, but the husband and wives too. They normally recover from a divorce within 2 to 3 years if there is not continued conflict. That is amazing. That is simply amazing. Now that study, it's an old study from 1989, but it's well cited. It's been cited over 1,200 times in different scientific articles. Even this year, 2021, is when I'm making this video. It's already been cited this year in scientific articles 4 times. Last year, in 2020, that article was cited 24 times. So it is a well-respected and validated study. This is sound science. The damage that happens to children is from continued conflict. If we want to reduce the damage done to children by divorce, we get along, we co-parent these kids together. We're partners. We made these kids together. We need to raise these kids together. When both of my children were born, I took them in front of the church and I dedicated them to the Lord, and I made a promise to God. I promised to raise my children for Him, and it wasn't conditional based on whether or not my wife divorced me. It was an unconditional promise to God. I promised to raise my child for Him, both of them. And so just because the divorce happened and the marriage failed doesn't mean that I no longer have a commitment to my children. And that commitment to my children involves getting along with their mother. It involves co-parenting with their mother. And we know from studies like Hetherington that that is essential for the members of the family to recover. You see, divorce does not end a family. It does not terminate the family. It reorganizes the family. So now instead of everybody living underneath one roof, one parent lives in one home and another parent lives in the other home, and the children move back and forth. Not the best situation, but if there is no longer continued conflict, all members of the family tend to adopt or adapt to this. And some studies have shown that the children of divorced families where co-parenting is taking place, a few years after the divorce, you can't tell the difference between them and children being raised in traditional homes. And that is, if you take academic tests to see where they're at in school, they test out the same. Just as likely to graduate high school, just as likely to go to college, just as likely to not be arrested, just as likely not to be incarcerated, just as likely not to get pregnant before marriage. So, co-parenting has a lot of good results for children. And now, sometimes that means taking the high road. And that is, in my situation, sometimes my ex-wife, she wasn't behaving the way I thought she should behave. But instead of going down to that level and misbehaving, I had to take the higher road, and act better. Now, in co-parenting, my ex-wife and I, we honored each other's punishments. So if she punished the children while they were visiting her and she told me about that punishment, I would honor that punishment when they came home. Same, she would do the same with me. If I punished the children, she came to pick up the children, and I say, I've taken Alex's cell phone away from him. I don't think he should have it all weekend long. She would honor that punishment. So we honored each other's punishments. Moreover, we celebrated birthdays together. We celebrated holidays together. We celebrated Christmas, Thanksgiving, even our family, culturally, we celebrate Halloween. I know some Christians don't do that, but it's not a religious thing. It's just a cultural thing. Different holidays, we would get together as a family and celebrate those holidays together, even though we're divorced. Thanksgiving, we had Thanksgiving dinner together. So this, provided some stability for the children, and I think that benefited them a lot. We would both attend their concerts together, their plays together, sporting events together. So, we provided a lot of support for the children. When my son received awards for being a scholar at his school, his high school, my wife and I both attended that together and had our pictures taken with him together. My daughter had a quinceañera, which is a Spanish event that 15-year-old girls, it's 15-year-old birthday. It's a pretty big event. It's about as big as a wedding. And my ex-wife and I both participated in her quinceañera together, even though we were already divorced. These are co-parenting techniques. These are things co-parents do, even though we're divorced. We get along for the sake of the children. You see, my son, when he grows up and gets married, he will treat his wife the way I treated his mother. And this is especially true if we're divorced. So it is very important for me to demonstrate to my son how a man is to treat his child's mother. And my daughter, she will be attracted to a man that treats her the way that I treat her mother. Wow. Think about that for a while. Daughters are attracted to men that treat them the way their father treats their mother. So how important is it for me to treat her mother good? If I want my daughter to be attracted to a healthy man that will treat her right, I need to treat her mother right. That's what co-parenting is all about. It's teaching our children by example. Unfortunately, most divorced parents avoid each other. That's the most common tactic. They're not fighting with each other after the divorce. They are avoiding each other. They're not going to attend a child's concert together. They certainly are not going to celebrate holidays together. They avoid each other. A minor amount of parents continue to fight. One statistic I saw was 15%. So 25% do co-parenting like my wife and I did. 25% of divorcees with children. This is just some statistics I saw. 15% continue to fight all the time, but the majority are avoiding each other. So those are three of the ways you can, the type of relationship you can have with your ex-wife is either a co-parenting relationship, a conflictive relationship, or an avoidance relationship. Avoidance is the number one type of relationship that is done. Co-parenting is number two. And then third is conflictive. And the conflictive does the most damage. But avoidance also damages the children, especially the daughters. Daughters get damaged the most by divorce. The boys tend to recover better. So, if you love your daughter, co-parenting is the way to go. Rebound relationships are very common after a divorce. Not healthy, but very common. Most people, especially when they're the so-called innocent party of the divorce, and that is that the husband or wife goes off and commits adultery, and there's an innocent party, that is, we say so-called innocent because nobody is really innocent. We all do things that aren't right and contribute to the breakdown of a marriage. But we say innocent because they're the party that was not committing adultery. So in this case, I was the so-called innocent party. And when the guilty party goes off with another individual in adultery, and the innocent party feels rejected, and if this hasn't happened to you, God bless you. It's not a good experience. But it's like there's a open wound, a bleeding wound or something, and you want to apply something to that wound to heal that wound. And getting into a relationship often does that, and a sexual relationship often makes a person feel better, and that is feel accepted, because the wife or the husband, whichever spouse it is, has committed adultery, and the person just feels so rejected, and to have another person accept you and accept you to the point where they're going to engage in sexual relations with you, it provides a temporary relief. It's not healthy because in the long run it just winds up hurting normally the other person, and that is the spouse, the innocent victim, or the innocent party in the divorce. In this case, it was me. Normally does not get hurt too much from that rebound relationship, but the other person involved in the relationship normally gets hurt. So and it prevents healing, so it prolongs healing. So it's going to take a certain amount of time after divorce to heal from that divorce. And when we get into a rebound relationship, it causes that time period to take longer, and sometimes prevents it entirely from happening. So family counselors and psychologists will normally recommend against rebound relationships for at least a year, just not to date anybody for a year, to stay out of that to stay out of the dating circle. The recently divorced person needs time to heal. That's not the advice I followed. Okay, and partially I blame my my counselor, because I talked to her about this and she thought it was okay for me to get into a relationship. But and her reasoning was that my divorce was drug out for 3.5 years, and during that period it was a separation, and she was thinking that I had time to heal during that period of time, but I don't agree with that, and I have never read anything that agrees with that. At the time, I had not studied psychology. I was not a family counselor at the time, and it was well after the fact that I went to graduate school and studied family counseling and became a family counselor. So at that time, I relied upon her perspective, and that's where she was coming from. But no, the 3.5 years of my divorce could be compared to a soldier going off to combat. Each day the soldier doesn't know if he's going to catch a bullet and die. He doesn't know if his friends are going to get killed. Each day his life is in suspense. It's hanging there, and he doesn't know if he's going to live or die. And the friends that he has bonded with around him, he doesn't know if they're going to live or die. So his life is in suspense during the time that he's in combat. Then he comes home and it's like, whew, it's all over. And that's when the soldiers tend to develop PTSD. They perform well while they're in combat, but they come out of combat. They come home. They're safe. And now their life is stable, right? Their feet are on solid ground. But that's when they develop the PTSD. And so it was with divorce. During that 3.5 years, I didn't know if I was going to lose my house, if I was going to lose my children, if they were going to be able to stay in school. You worry about all types of things. My children are going to get into drugs. My daughter's going to get pregnant prematurely. All these bad things. All the statistics, things that happen to children of divorce, and you just try to imagine your life after. If my wife gets custody of the children, she's not going to send them to school, Christian school. What's going to happen to my kids in public school? Is she going to play games with visitation and try to prevent me from seeing the children? Just all this is anxiety, and life is being suspended, and I don't know what the future holds for me or for my children that I'm bonded to. And so for 3.5 years, my life was suspended. So I was not recovering from the divorce. I was not recovering from the end of my marriage. I was kind of in combat mode. I was fighting for custody of my children, for the future of my children, so that I could determine their future. I could see that they go to Christian school and that they have good schooling, and I could see that they have a good relationship with both parents. That I could have a certain amount of control over that. And so during that 3.5 years, life was suspended. So during the last year of those 3.5 years, I kind of started dating my dentist. She'd been my dentist for 6 years. She wasn't a stranger. But even dating, we would meet in the park and talk. We'd sit in her car and we would visit each other in the park for a couple hours each Sabbath in the afternoon. And that was the extent of our dating. So that number one, that really wasn't enough dating to get to know her and get to know her personality and so forth before marrying her. But number two, the dating or the timing was all wrong. Now, since both of us were Christians, we didn't believe in premarital sex. And so instead of making the mistake of having premarital sex, like many people do, we made a different mistake, like also many Christians do, and that is that we got married prematurely. Okay. See, a lot of Christians, they do not believe in premarital sex, and so their solution to that is to get married prematurely. They are sexually aroused, they want to have sex with each other, they believe it's wrong to do it if they're not married, and so they get married. But getting married prematurely is simply a different mistake. So instead of making mistake A, we make mistake B. And in this context, not only did I make mistake B, but I also made mistake C, and that is getting involved in a romantic relationship immediately after my marriage. I should have waited 1 year. But like I said, I don't take the entire blame myself. Maybe some people think I should, but I was seeing a Christian counselor who was licensed as a counselor, and I was paying her $135 a session. So I was getting what I felt was professional guidance, and she didn't see an issue in that relationship, nor did she see an issue with getting married quickly after my divorce, because in her thinking the divorce was 3.5 years long and it had strung out. My children objected to this marriage, and she says, well, your children will get used to it. The children if you wait a year, they're going to object a year from now. When my children did object, I first went to my girlfriend at the time and told her I thought we should wait a year to give the children the time to adapt. And she objected. This is my girlfriend who became my second wife. She objected. Actually, she had an emotional meltdown, and she started crying and saying things, and it was not a good situation. And it's after she started crying and not wanting to delay it is when I went and talked to my therapist about this. And that is when my therapist said, no, Shane, go ahead. Your divorce has drug out 3.5 years. You've adapted. You've adjusted to the fact that your marriage is over, and getting remarried will help you heal. Your children will adjust to it. So, initially, when my children did not want me to marry, I had suggested that we delay it a year. My girlfriend at the time had an emotional meltdown, talked to my counselor. My counselor said it was okay. So I went ahead and got married. I got cold feet, but I went through with it anyways. Day of the wedding, I just felt emotionally blank, numb. I didn't know what was going on. I just thought it was a case of cold feet, and I would be the type of husband that I'm supposed to be, and things would work out. But things didn't work out from the very beginning. And my personality was not compatible with her personality. I know that now. Furthermore, I developed PTSD, which is why I felt numb on my wedding day. PTSD normally sets in about 30 days after the traumatic event ends. I got married 30 days after my divorce was signed by the judge. I was just emotionally numb during that whole marriage. It lasted a year, and I was depressed. I had a lot of depression. I had a lot of anxiety. I wasn't there. I wasn't capable of being a husband at that point in my life. And she was an immigrant. I live on the border, the Texas-Mexico border. And like I said, she was my dentist for 6 years, but her dental office is just 12 miles down the road. She crossed the international bridge. She lived there. She was Mexican. She was bilingual, so she spoke English, and she attended church here on this side of the border, and her children attended school with my children, and we all spoke English. We all spoke Spanish too. We were all bilingual. But because of the marriage, she was able to get her U.S. residency, and within the first month, I knew the marriage was a mistake, and I mentioned it to her, and I asked her if she didn't think we had made a mistake, and of course she was very resistant to giving up on the marriage. After a year, there was a lot of conflict between our children. Our children fought a lot, and she fought with my daughter a lot. So it was not a good home. My children, my home with my first wife, we got along, but we didn't have a conflictive home. We didn't have a home where we were fighting all the time, and my children were not used to a home like that, and that's just not a healthy home. Unfortunately, we weren't compatible. And after a year, I realized that if I divorced her, she would be able to maintain her U.S. residency, because I didn't want to divorce her and cause her to get deported. Divorce is a big enough trauma itself. To get divorced and deported at the same time, and I told my kids, early on, after we'd been married 2 or 3 months, I says, let's just stick this out until she can stay here and won't get deported. And if things don't improve, once we get to that point where she'll no longer be deported, I'll divorce her. And that's what I told my kids. And maybe I shouldn't have, but my kids were complaining about her, and that's how things played out. And so after a year of marriage, I learned that if I divorced her, she'd be able to stay. And so I went and I got the divorce papers from the county, and we had no marital assets to fight over. We had no children to fight over. It was a very clean divorce. And honestly, it didn't even feel like a divorce. It felt more like breaking up with a girlfriend in high school. There's some hurt feelings there, but those go away after a few days, and life goes on. We didn't know each other very well when we got married. We tried it. It didn't work. We called it quits. It was a mistake. It was a mistake, and I shouldn't have gotten married so quickly after the divorce, and shouldn't have gotten prematurely married. And the reason we got married was because we were both sexually aroused, and she had been separated from her husband for 6 years at the time, so she had not been sexually involved with anyone for 6 years, and I hadn't been sexually involved with my wife for 3.5 years. So we were both two lonely people, and our reasons for getting married were not correct, and that's a lesson learned. And luckily, that marriage didn't produce any children, because that would have been a real tragedy. There is that out of a mistaken marriage, two people getting married that shouldn't have gotten married, and then they make a child. That would have been a very big mistake. And as it turns out, it was a mistake, but it wasn't a major mistake. Life as a single dad was pretty good. I have to tell you that. I know that a lot of single parents really struggle, and it is a challenge, especially single mothers that don't have the finances. But in my case, my career was progressing, so I was getting raises, I was getting jobs that paid more money, my mortgage was paid off, and after my rebound marriage ended, my anxiety level just dropped. I was diagnosed with PTSD, so I started getting treatment for that, responded very well to treatment, just felt like the sun was shining and the birds were singing, and it was just a beautiful day. Life just became bright and happy and wonderful. In fact, I'd never been so happy in my life, and I looked back on my life and I was wondering why what is so different now. And I looked back on my life, the traumatic childhood, and one would understand why that wasn't so great. And then going to college, well, college is stressful, more so for some than others, but coming out of a traumatic childhood, I already had anxiety issues. Never had panic attacks, but college was stressful. And then right out of college, or at the very end of college, I got married, and my first wife, she had some issues, not major at first, but still, my life, became centered around making my wife happy. And so, my first wife was a high maintenance wife, and that caused me some anxiety. Now, I don't want to say I didn't enjoy it or that I wasn't happy. I was very, very happy in most of my marriage. And for the most part, my first marriage was a very positive and happy experience for me. Okay, but look at what I was comparing it to. Everything is relative. If you go outside and it's hot outside, well, what does hot mean? Is it 80 degrees outside, or is it 115 degrees outside? What is hot? So happy is also a relative thing. So I was very happy in my first marriage, but that happiness was being compared to my college years and my childhood. So, which childhood was pretty bad, college was a bit stressful. So at that point in my life, my first marriage, I was happy, I felt happy, it was the happiest I had ever been. And then we went into the divorce, the 3.5 year divorce period, and the 1 year rebound marriage. And that was no doubt the most stressful, the most difficult period of my time. And they say the morning comes after the night, right? Or the calm comes after the storm. And so coming out of that period, which was the single dad period, when I was a single dad, wow, all I had to really worry about is maintaining my job, keeping my boss happy, doing that which I was trained to do, and my children, watching out for my children. And my children, we did a pretty good job of raising my children. My first wife and I, in cooperation with the church and the church school, they say it takes a village, and my first wife and I, in cooperation with the church school and the church, we did a pretty good job raising these kids. And so when I was a single dad and these kids were teenagers, it was not that difficult. Of course, at first, Shania was 12 and Alex was 14. That's at the very end, actually at the end of the rebound marriage was a year later, so they were 13 and 15. I had to do more things for them, but then as they grew older, they did more and more things and started doing more chores around the house, and life became a bit easier. I feel that I was a single dad during much of the divorce because my wife, even though part of the divorce she was living with us, she was not interacting with us. So I was putting the kids to bed and getting them up in the morning, preparing their meals. I was taking them to their doctor's visits and everything that needed to be done, all the parenting. So really, from the time that my daughter was 9, I was a single parent. But when the divorce was over and the rebound marriage was over and all of that was over, she was 13 and Alex was 15, and like I said, it was just wonderful. It was a wonderful period of my life. I started taking the children on vacations every year, and we drove up to the Midwest and saw my family and took them to the college where I went to college at, and then the next year we went out to California, or did we go to California first, or we went to Washington, D.C.? I don't know the order of them, but one year we took a road trip. We went out to Four Corners and saw the Grand Canyon and Hoover Dam, and went out to California, and we saw their great aunt on their mother's side, and then we came back through Phoenix and White Sands, and just great road trip, and then took them to Washington, D.C., and they have a great uncle there on their mother's side who's an Adventist pastor, and my daughter Shania was able to sing special music at his church. It was at Christmas time, so it was a Christmas special. She played the piano and sang music at his church. We rented a car and drove up to New York and saw the Statue of Liberty. It was a good time with my children. Another time we took a road trip up through Arkansas and then came down through New Orleans, and we got on a riverboat and sailed up the Mississippi River. Another time we took a road trip up to Austin, and we went through the State Museum there and went through the State Capitol and into the State Senate. So taken numerous road trips with the children, and as a single dad, and bonded with the kids. Just being a single dad has been a rewarding experience, and I'll cherish those years forever. And during the time, there was no conflict between me and their mother. We were co-parenting and we were getting along. So we didn't take their mother on any of the road trips with us, but occasionally she would come and attend church, and she'd even sit the same pew with us. I mean, we were divorced, so we didn't sit together. She would sit on one side of the kids and I would sit on the other side of the kids. But life was good. Life was without conflict. My stress level was low. Anxiety was low. And being a single dad, did have a lot of responsibilities, but it was not that bad. After the rebound marriage ended, I took a year off from dating. No dating at all. And I did a lot of things that I enjoyed. I started horseback riding, took horseback riding lessons. That was one thing that I started doing, and picked up the guitar and playing the guitar a little bit more as a treatment for my post-traumatic stress disorder. I spent more time studying the Bible, doing morning devotions in the morning, doing mindfulness, form of meditation, exercise, eating healthier. I lost a lot of weight. I would take hot baths. I would go and actually get a massage once a month. Did just a lot of things of taking care of myself. I joined a support group, a PTSD support group, and got some ideas of different ways to deal with it. I responded quite well to that. And after a year, I was tested again for PTSD. And I went from an 88, where originally when I was tested for PTSD, I had a score of 88 out of 100. And after a year of therapy, I tested at 29 out of 100. So it was a dramatic improvement in the post-traumatic stress disorder. After a year, I did start dating, and I dated a handful of different women. And the only one that became serious is the one that I eventually married. Most of the time when I dated a girl, it was a one-date shot. But I enjoyed it. I'd meet a girl at a restaurant, or pick her up. Sometimes I picked her up at her house and took her out to a restaurant, and just the company and getting to know her and so forth. But after, I'm trying to recall, I think it was 3 girls that I dated, and they were just one dates. Just went on one date with them. And then there was the 4th girl that I don't know if I want to say that I dated her, because she might disagree and say that we weren't dating. But I was interested in dating her. I was interested in her romantically. She was also a Seventh-day Adventist. She lived up in Houston, which is about 5-hour drive from here. And I told her up front that I was interested in dating her, but I wanted to first have a friendship with her. And if we got along well as friends, that it could work into dating and eventually marriage. But I told her my timeline, is probably like 2 or 3 years, So, and she said, "Oh, yeah, she would want to be a friend. I'm receptive to that." And she says, as far as dating, we'll see what happens. So she didn't say yes, she didn't say no. Let's see what God does. I think that was her response to that. And so I would, I would drive up there. Sometimes I start sentences and I don't finish them. I would drive up there and visit her on the weekends when my children were with their mother. Not every weekend, but I did that, I think, on 3 occasions. And then I would spend the weekend with her, and I would sleep in her son's bed, and I guess her son slept on the couch. I don't know. But I really enjoyed spending some time with her. But she had an ex-boyfriend that she was still hung up on. She had a couple of children, 3. She had 3 children, 2 of them living with her. And she had an ex-boyfriend that she was very hung up on. And so that's why I called it quits with her. It's not that I did not like her, actually. I liked her quite a lot. Of course, I wasn't in love with her. We were not romantic. But I did like her a lot. And once I even took my children with me for the weekend, and the children stayed up there with me during that weekend, and my children liked her. But it wasn't meant to be, And I think she's a wonderful person, and we're still friends on Facebook. But it never moved from the friendship phase into the dating phase. Then a friend of mine owns what used to be Club Adventist. Now it's called Adventistan.com. It's a Adventist forum online. I've been involved in this since 2001. I've written thousands of posts on it. It was around before Facebook. And he is a good friend of mine. I met him at the General Conference in 2015 in San Antonio. And he knew about the issues that I was dealing with, and he also owns an Adventist dating site, and he gave me a free membership to an Adventist dating site. And my wife and I met on that dating site, and that starts out with a compatibility test. And so we took the compatibility test. We were 87% compatible. We started chatting back and forth. I gave her my Facebook information. She got Facebook. We got our WhatsApp accounts. We dated each other for 19 months online before we married. She was working in Lebanon. She's Filipino. She was working in Lebanon. I went over to Lebanon and spent some time with her over Christmas vacation while my ex-wife had my children, and then I flew over there and took vacation. And I made it up for my children. I took vacation without them. And so the way I made up for that is I sent them together to Panama to see their aunt, their mother's sister, and spend a couple weeks with them in the summer. So, I did feel bad about leaving my children behind on vacation. What kind of father is going to do that? So I made up for it by sending them down to Panama. And it was much hotter in Panama. They thought the Rio Grande Valley where we live at was hot. But I was a soldier in Panama, and I knew all about that heat and humidity down there. And so they got to taste what real tropical heat is like. So they were not all that impressed with the summer heat in Panama. But I digress. My wife and I seem to be very compatible. We've been married a little over a year as I make this video. We don't fight. We have had a couple misunderstandings that were resolved, and that's a couple misunderstandings in over a year. So, and they were resolved maturely, as we would expect them to be resolved. The church that I attend has a high population of Filipinos, so being Filipino herself, the adjustment from one country to the other and immigrating has been a little smoother because of the Filipino, but it also happened during the pandemic, and she came here just before the pandemic started, and the pandemic's been tough on everybody regardless what circumstance you're in, but especially when you're immigrating to a new country and you're trying to get used to a new life, and then being confined like the pandemic has done to us has been difficult. We did take another road trip with my kids with my new wife, and it's the longest road trip we went on. It was a 5,000-mile road trip. We drove from the Rio Grande Valley up through Amarillo, Texas. So we stopped at Palo Duro Canyon. Then we went to Denver, Colorado. And from Denver, we went over to Salt Lake City. And we went out to the Great Salt Lake. And we saw the Mormon Temple and the Utah Capitol. And then from there, we shot up through Idaho. We entered Yellowstone Park through Montana. And it got into Yellowstone Park. We spent the night in Wyoming there, and then we went over to Devil's Tower, and then we went into South Dakota, and we went to Mount Rushmore, and then we cut down through Iowa, and we stopped there, and I took the children to the treatment facility, because when I was 15 years old and I went through drug rehab for treatment, it was in Sioux City, Iowa, and I actually took them to the treatment facility where I went through drug rehab at. And not to be outdone, my wife and I met a girl that was in drug rehab with me. Wow. We were 15 years old together, and during this road trip, I was 50 years old. That's 35 years later. Her and I were in drug rehab together, and then we meet up together again 35 years later with my wife. That was great. And then we come down through Nebraska into Kansas, and we stopped at the home of an old school teacher of mine. Seventh Day Adventist school teacher, taught me school in Seattle. He was my school teacher for 4.5 years, from grade 4 through grade 8. He was a father figure to me. He took me to my first baseball game. He took me to my first amusement park. We broke down a lawnmower engine, completely tore it apart, and rebuilt it together. He was very much a father figure to me. And now he is in his elder years, and I was able to stop by and see him for the first time since I was 16 years old. And so that was special. Then we came down through Oklahoma, came down through Texas, through Dallas, Fort Worth, Austin, El Paso. No, I'm sorry, not El Paso, San Antonio. And so that was a great road trip. And then pandemic, sets in, and we're trying to get her son. My wife has an adult child. He was 20 years old, and we're trying to get him his visa here. And the Trump administration at the time had put a stop on all visas. He wasn't letting anybody come in to the United States unless they're emergency visas. And so I had to get with my congressman, and it took a lot of work, but we got my stepson's case declared an emergency, so he was granted an emergency visa, and we finally got him here right before he turned 21, because once he turned 21, he'd no longer be eligible, and that's how we were able to get his visa classified as an emergency visa, because he had to get here before he was 21, or he'd no longer be eligible. So now, when I record this video, we're in this window when I have all my kids at home. I've got the 2 sons and the daughter and the wife, and soon things will change. The children will start leaving home, and it won't be too long that my wife and I will be here alone, unless we take in some foster children, or who knows what the Lord has in store for us. But that is where I'm at today. During those years as a single dad, I did something that I always wanted to do but could never have done when I was married. I went back to graduate school and got my master's degree in family counseling. It was a 3-year degree. Montemorelos, University de Montemorelos, Spanish-speaking university in Mexico. That meant all the coursework, all the exams, all the research papers, everything was done in Spanish. And it's an Adventist university. I heard about that program, that family counseling program at Montemorelos, when I first moved here in 1998, and I always wanted to attend it. But like I said, my first wife was just too high maintenance. I could have never attended graduate school and been a husband and a father. And so then the children were just at the right age where they were able to take care of themselves enough that I was able to do my studies, and God opened that door for me, and that happened, and I'm very grateful for that. And now, as I record this video, I am at a different university, Jacksonville Theological Seminary. It is a seminary for Christian counselors and pastors. They provide graduate degrees for pastors, and I'm studying Christian counseling to get my PhD in Christian counseling, and it's in temperament therapy. And so I'm learning how to be what they call a temperament counselor. So God, I don't know where God has taken my life, but this is where I'm at. Divorce is no walk in the park. I don't believe it is ever God's will for people to get divorced. Divorce is caused by the hardness of hearts, either one of the spouses or both of the spouses. Unfortunately, divorce happens, and it's something that as individuals sometimes we have to deal with that, and as a church we have to deal with it. Divorce almost always hurts children. They are normally the most innocent party and the most damaged party. So we want to do as much as we can to avoid divorce. Divorce almost always results in identity crisis. After a divorce happens, it's not that a husband and wife both go their separate ways. They tear apart, and they both leave the marriage with a part of the other. And it takes a while for them to figure out who they are and figure out how they're going to live in the world now that they're not that way. Church members and friends of the couple also feel a little awkward oftentimes, because the marriage is like a third entity. Say Dick and Jane are married and then Dick and Jane get divorced. Well, it's like the marriage of Dick and Jane. It's almost like the marriage itself was a third person. So we have Dick and we have Jane and we have their marriage, and we were friends of Dick and Jane. We were friends of the marriage, and now that marriage has died, and it's almost like a friend has died. And so then we are left dealing with Dick and Jane, and how is our relationship going to act, or how is it going to be structured with either Dick or with Jane, now that the marriage is dead. And that's awkward for many church members, but that's just a fact of life. That's something that we have to deal with. And we really want, I think, as church members, we really want to avoid taking sides, and because that is normally not productive. And if they start complaining to us about their ex-spouse, we find some nice way to listen to them and be supportive of them without taking a side, and it can be difficult, especially if both spouses continue to attend church in the same congregation. But that is a reality that we deal with. Co-parenting is so important, and if we are friends of a married couple that have divorced and one is complaining about the other or whatnot, we want to do as much as we can to encourage co-parenting, because co-parenting is so important. It's almost like a father paying child support. We've gotten to the point in society now that fathers are expected to pay child support, and if they don't pay child support, that is if they're the non-custodial father, if they don't pay child support, they're considered a deadbeat dad. We almost want to create that type of societal pressure on a divorced couple to co-parent their children, that the couple needs to feel like society expects them to get along for the benefit of their children. Just like society expects the non-custodial parent to pay child support, we expect that couple to get along for the sake of the children. And so when an ex-spouse is complaining or whatnot to us, gently, lovingly, we need to try to support the concept of co-parenting, because that is so important. Dating after a divorce shouldn't date the first year. A person after a divorce needs a year, at least a year, to work through the mourning and the loss, because that marriage, just like I'd mentioned, it's like a third person. When the marriage ends, it's like a person is dying, and the spouses need to grieve that loss. If a man dies and leaves a widow behind, people would raise their eyebrows if that widow just went out and started dating right away. She would mourn the loss of her husband for probably a year before she would start to date again. And it's similar with divorcees. Divorcees need to mourn the loss. And then once they start dating again, they need to have that ample amount of time. Date for, a year and a half, year and a half, and before getting married again. That take time. Compatibility tests are very important, especially the second time around, getting remarried the second time. Step families can work. They're not doomed to failure. However, all the children that are going to be involved in the step family should all be underneath 10 years old, or they should all be over 15 years old. If they are in the age of 10 to 15, that is not a good time to form a step family. That age to 10 to 15-year-olds, it's very, very difficult. It is best just to stay as a single parent. If you're dating somebody, go ahead and date that person and wait until the youngest child is over 15 years old. That is sound guidance. Now, whether or not somebody accepts that guidance is up to each individual, but it is just so difficult to make a marriage, a step family work that has children between 10 and 15 when the family was formed. If the children are younger than that when the family was formed, that family can go through that phase. But starting a step family with children between the ages of 10 and 15 is the most difficult time to start a blended family. And blended families are also more difficult than regular step families. Blended families is where both the husband and the wife have custody of their children. And so everybody, the husband's children and the wife's children, everybody's living in the same house together. Those are the most difficult step families to make work, the pure blended family. And if they're formed between ages of, when the children are between ages 10 and 15, wow, that is super difficult. So that is something to consider. Okay. The church has a great support, should be great support for the divorcees, inviting divorcees to be involved in ministries, if it's children's ministries, women's ministries, men's ministries, prison ministries, motorcycle ministries, any outlet, Adventist Youth Society, prayer meeting, whatever, getting the people involved as much as they can. Now, single parents don't have as much time, but still reaching out, asking them to do special music, to tell the children's story, whatever, any way to get them involved. And members inviting them over to their house for lunch after Sabbath, letting people know that they are a member of the family of God, and that their divorce doesn't put an X on them and doesn't make them rated X, and it doesn't mean that God doesn't love them, because God is crazy about them, and they need to know that more if they're divorced than before when their family was together. Same goes for maybe single mothers that were never divorced and they got pregnant outside of wedlock and they had children. The church needs to reach out and bring these people into the church so they feel loved and so they feel part of the organization. I think that is pretty much a summary of this, and I am going to end this with a prayer. Heavenly Father, you know that whoever is watching this video, that either they are dealing with divorce in their lives right now, or they have dealt with divorce in the lives of one of their children or brothers or sisters, somebody close to them, or they're in a church ministry where they are involved with people that have gone through divorce, and they're looking to have a better understanding of divorce and a better way that they can show your love and that they can help draw that person dealing with divorce and those children, help draw them into a relationship with Jesus Christ. We pray that you be with each and every one of these. In Jesus' name, amen. God bless you. This is a tremendous ministry. Ministering to broken families is an incredible calling. Okay, this is the page that is supposed to have the citations, and they didn't get entered into this presentation. We will be posting them on the YouTube site of this video. So if you look at the description, video description on the YouTube site, you'll be able to find the citations that were used during this presentation.